Have you ever wondered why your energy bills keep going up when the government promised they would go down? A large portion of your energy bills goes towards paying for transmission, the poles and wires that carry electricity across the grid. And more wind and solar means a lot more transmission. Just like water utilities, transmission companies don't face competition, and most households can't go off-grid. So once a company like Transgrid builds some transmission, you pay for it through your electricity bills. And the more they build, the more they get paid. It's the regulator's job, together with the Australian energy market operator, to keep the likes of Transgrid in check. Before Transgrid builds projects, AEMO confirms they're needed and the regulator approves the extra charges for consumers. But what happens when the energy market bodies who are supposed to protect consumer interests start siding with the very companies they're meant to keep in check? In August of 2024, the chair of the regulator, Claire Savage, said, "We've made quite a number of concessions to try and support this project, and to see Transgrid be able to invest in it." In this video, we'll show you how a project that appeared to make economic sense when it cost $1.3 billion, but looked dubious when costs rose to $3.3 billion, was just approved at $4.6 billion. You'll see exactly how the regulator and AEMO helped this project skirt the regulatory hurdles meant to protect consumers from bad investments.
Snowy Hydro 2.0 is the biggest battery ever built in Australia. It will make renewables reliable.
Snowy 2.0, Australia's most infamous pumped hydro project, has already experienced multiple cost blowouts to the tune of $10 billion, even before including the cost of the extra transmission needed to connect it to Sydney and Melbourne. HumeLink is Snowy 2.0's connection to Sydney, and Transgrid is the company building it. It's the project Claire Savage, chair of the regulator, was talking about here. So why did the regulator need to make so many concessions for HumeLink? Well, there are a number of regulatory hurdles that projects have to clear from both the regulator and AEMO. In 2020, AEMO released the second Integrated System Plan.
The Integrated System Plan is Australia's electricity master plan. By modelling the transmission lines that cross the country and the generators attached to them, it finds the optimal places and times to build new transmission lines. Once it finds out that some of those lines might be needed soon, it asks transmission companies to estimate what it might cost to build them.
The 2020 ISP finds that Australia would probably benefit from a transmission line between southwest of Sydney, Snowy 2.0, and the Victorian border. So Transgrid writes up a report estimating that the project would cost $1.35 billion. By unlocking the value of Snowy 2.0, it would deliver double that in total benefits, giving a net benefit of $1.4 billion. Looks like pretty good value for consumers. First hurdle cleared. But a year later, Transgrid makes some more detailed cost estimates, and it turns out the original estimates were far too low. Costs had more than doubled to $3.3 billion. Here, HumeLink faces a potentially project-stopping hurdle. To get approval for the first stage of the project, it needs to pass a test known as the feedback loop.
The feedback loop is the final check with the master plan before Transgrid asks the regulator to approve expenditure on the project. Transgrid tells AEMO the updated costs, and AEMO reruns their own model to check if the project is worth delivering at the time being proposed. The feedback loop needs to be run on the most recent master plan, the ISP, which gets updated every 2 years.
In late 2021, when the cost blowout to $3.27 billion was revealed, the most recent ISP was the 2020 edition. This was the master plan that recommended getting started on HumeLink, but based on the previous cost estimate, less than half the newly estimated price. Transgrid would have been nervous that conducting a feedback loop against the 2020 ISP was unlikely to find HumeLink good value for consumers. But around this time, the 2022 ISP was being drafted. Instead of using the most recent final ISP, AEMO broke the rules and allowed the feedback loop to be done on a draft.
AEMO did this by publishing an ISP update to the 2020 ISP at the same time that they released the consultation draft for the 2022 ISP. This meant that the work in the in-progress draft became the current plan before any consultation had taken place. In every ISP, AEMO models a new optimal development path, which tells you the list of projects that should start being built soon. The national electricity rules at the time stated that for an ISP update, AEMO must consult on the new information and the impact on the optimal development path.
They didn't do that. And this consultation matters because consumers deserve to have their concerns taken seriously. The door should always be open for potential changes to the final plan following consultation, especially in the case of HumeLink, where AEMO did several things consumer representatives were not happy about. AEMO broke the rules and skipped the consultation, which meant HumeLink got feedback loop approval against the draft 2022 ISP without the necessary scrutiny. And AEMO did this with the full knowledge of the regulator. AEMO had checked in with the regulator months earlier, and the regulator gave AEMO a formal letter agreeing to look the other way while they breached the rules that were meant to protect consumers. So HumeLink was approved based on the draft 2022 ISP. But why did that ISP desperately need proper scrutiny?
Well, like any plan, AEMO needed to assess how things could pan out in different possible futures or scenarios. The 2022 ISP used 5 scenarios to check the benefits provided by different projects. But to make a final decision on whether a project was needed, they had to consider the likelihood of each scenario and then weight each scenario accordingly in the decision. To determine these weights, AEMO convened a panel of experts and stakeholders.
The panel chose weights for the collection of scenarios. Under these weights, HumeLink wasn't needed immediately, so it should have been put on ice. But following government announcements at COP26, AEMO decided to remove a scenario that didn't favour HumeLink. They then convened a second panel to reassess the weights of the remaining scenarios. But not everyone from the first panel attended the second. Only 2 of the 20 panel members were consumer representatives. The sessions were too rushed for any meaningful debate to take place, and AEMO did not publicly consult on the outcomes of the second panel, breaking the rules in their own official methodology. The official consumer representatives were not happy about this. Despite all these problems, AEMO adopted the scenario weights of the second panel for the draft 2022 ISP. This put HumeLink back in the game. Well, almost. The modelling showed that HumeLink should be built in the late 2020s or early 2030s, which was still so far away that it would be put on hold. But AEMO thought the scenarios still couldn't be trusted and argued that HumeLink should get started now and TransGrid should start getting paid for insurance reasons. So they split the project into stages.
In Stage 1, early works, TransGrid would develop plans, negotiate with landholders, and get better quotes from contractors. Then, in a few years, Stage 2, the rest of the project could be built if suddenly it became urgent or delayed if it wasn't.
Now, the official consumer representatives were very critical of AEMO's argument that Stage 1 early works should be started for insurance reasons at a cost of $330 million. AEMO had factored in the value of rushing ahead, but they hadn't considered the value of waiting to see how things would pan out. But it was too late to change anything because the feedback loop had already been approved on the draft ISP. The draft plan did have one key protection for consumers. AEMO included decision rules for HumeLink and its sister project in Victoria, VNI West.
These decision rules are like kill switches, which put the second stage of a project on hold if one of 2 things happens. Costs increase significantly, or coal plants keep running for longer than forecast. These, according to AEMO's modelling, were the deciding factors for whether delivering the project early would actually be valuable.
Most stakeholder submissions to the draft ISP supported the decision rules, while others, including the regulators, requested more clarity over what would be enough to trigger these kill switches. But after all the feedback came in, and after both HumeLink and VNI West had already set sail, the final 2022 ISP was published, and AEMO had ditched the decision rules altogether. They said that stakeholders thought those kill switches didn't really help consumers anyway. Which stakeholders? Only 2. TransGrid and Snowy Hydro, the companies set to profit the most from HumeLink, even if it provided little to no benefits for consumers. We now know that both decision rules would have been triggered, and had they been kept, HumeLink would have been put on ice. So following the 2022 ISP, HumeLink Stage 1 early works was given the go-ahead. Transgrid started talking to communities, scoping out the route, and finding builders for Stage 2. Fast forward a year, and Transgrid wanted to add $200 million to early works to pay upfront for some long lead equipment. This means another feedback loop and a chance to see AEMO and the regulator in action.
When applying the feedback loop, AEMO needs to consider the total costs of HumeLink, not just the stage being applied for. This ensures consumers aren't forced to keep throwing good money after bad if the project as a whole no longer makes economic sense.
But between the feedback loop being run in May 2023 and the regulator making a decision, something big happens. On July 18, while being questioned in New South Wales Parliament, the CEO of Transgrid appears to reluctantly acknowledge that HumeLink is likely to end up costing not $1 billion, not $3 billion, but $5 billion. As it turns out, Transgrid knew well before they applied for the feedback loop on April 6, as they had already received a cost estimate from an independent estimator and the first stage of tender submissions from contractors. So if Transgrid knew of the substantial cost increase well before they applied to AEMO for the feedback loop assessment, did AEMO ask about this or suspect the changes before they approved it? AEMO was consulting on a draft report detailing costs of transmission options at this exact time. They had every reason to ask whether there had been a cost increase. In fact, AEMO was present in the meetings with Transgrid and their advisory council, including one on March 23. During this meeting, AEMO coached Transgrid through the regulatory process for the feedback loop, while also hearing that the quotes from contractors had been assessed. So AEMO must have known the costs were on their way up, yet still let HumeLink pass the feedback loop. So just how open was the open secret that costs had already risen for HumeLink? Very open, as it turns out. Back in 2022, the regulator got an independent consultancy to assess Transgrid's proposal for Stage 1, and those consultants concluded that it was inevitable that HumeLink's costs would exceed the estimate at the time. At the end of July 2023, AEMO published a transmission costs report with HumeLink's new price tag of $4.9 billion. And yet on August 25, the regulator approved Transgrid's application for the additional $200 million as if nothing had changed. At this point, it is crystal clear the regulator knew. 3 days before their decision, they wrote to Transgrid telling them the increase meant they needed to reassess the route. And this was in response to a letter from Transgrid a month beforehand asking about the cost blowout. So both the regulator and AEMO knew costs had officially gone up weeks before Transgrid was awarded another $200 million of consumers' money. But the material change in circumstances assessment is a major hurdle for Transgrid. The regulator told them to do the assessment as soon as possible because checking the cost increases against the current ISP meant they risked needing to start the whole process from scratch.
Now, a material change in circumstances is legalese for a change that actually matters. And in this case, that's any change which means that Transgrid reasonably thinks that the best version of HumeLink has changed. Here, the significant cost increase means that they need to check if a shorter version of the project will be better. If it turns out that it is, they need to restart the approval process for the new version.
So did Transgrid actually do what the regulator told them to do? No! While the regulator wanted the material change in circumstances assessment done ASAP, Transgrid submitted it 6 months later, 70 days after submitting the application for HumeLink's construction. And in response, the regulator publicly sent a stern letter warning Transgrid they were at risk of being non-compliant for doing things out of order. But in private, the regulator had actually been talking to Transgrid for months, giving them tacit approval to skirt the rules. So while the regulator was publicly telling Transgrid off for not following their directions, privately they were saying, look, don't worry about it. So Transgrid knew they could submit the assessment late, but they still had the problem of passing the feedback loop. Thankfully for them, just like last time, the regulator and AEMO worked together to run an ISP update, look the other way, and let HumeLink through on a draft ISP with some surprises in it. When Transgrid finally performed the material change assessment, HumeLink's net benefits had supposedly quadrupled from $1 to nearly $4 billion. In August, when the regulator released its final decision to fund HumeLink, two reports from independent consultants exposed the creative accounting in TransGrid's cost-benefit analysis. The supposedly quadrupled net benefits? Way off by $3 billion. TransGrid probably slipped in the benefits of the sister project in Victoria, VNI West, in their calculations. We say probably because the regulator asked TransGrid for a comment on how this happened, but declined to share TransGrid's response. Come December 2023, TransGrid was seeking another feedback loop check, this time on the draft 2024 ISP, asking for $4.5 billion to build HumeLink. Had the check been done on the final 2022 ISP, a 33% cost escalation in real terms would probably have frozen the project. We know this because independent engineers had checked what would happen with a 50% increase, and it put HumeLink's benefits deep in the red. So TransGrid could only hope that the next plan showed enough benefits to cover their ballooning costs. And conveniently, there were a number of changes in that ISP that tilted the scale in HumeLink's favour again. Snowy 2.0 was mysteriously uprated from 2 gigawatts to 2.2 gigawatts. This increased the storage capacity HumeLink could connect to the grid without increasing costs because the model treated Snowy 2.0 as free. And New South Wales committed to expanding the Central West Orana Renewable Energy Zone, so it became free in the ISP with the added capacity also boosting HumeLink's business case on paper. But there's one massive leg up that outshines them all. Locking in the 82% renewables by 2030 target across all scenarios. AEMO admitted that this target was the biggest driver for the need to deliver HumeLink quickly. This is deeply ironic because achieving 82% renewables by 2030 was supposed to be a consequence of building transmission more quickly, but now the assumption we will hit 82% renewables is being used to drive transmission. The tail is wagging the dog. This is a serious betrayal of consumer interests by the government.
Experts broadly consider the 82% target to be highly unlikely to be achieved. Yet every scenario in the ISP assumes it will happen. This forces the ISP to model a massive 8 gigawatts of renewable capacity being built annually from 2025 to 2030, more than triple the recent average rate of 2.5 gigawatts per year, even as the renewables industry faces a slump in investments.
Locking this target into the model inflated the apparent benefits of HumeLink in the draft 2024 ISP. Since the whole plan was now completely divorced from reality, there was no prospect of HumeLink's recommended delivery date being the best timing for consumers. But the most dubious shenanigans in the ISP had to do with the delivery date for HumeLink. Despite all the hurdles the draft 2024 ISP helped HumeLink jump over, Snowy 2.0 was still going to be delivered years after HumeLink's original delivery date. As a result, the ISP found the ideal date for HumeLink to be 2029-30, 3 years later than TransGrid's rushed schedule, which meant TransGrid was rushing HumeLink ahead for no good reason. In fact, their own analysis showed that the project would likely be delivered 600 days behind schedule, with less than a 1% chance of being delivered on time. But the regulator still somehow deemed TransGrid's timeline as reasonable. So how does the regulator approve HumeLink on a schedule the system doesn't need and the proponent can't deliver? Well, as it turns out, 6 months before the draft 2024 ISP was published, a loophole was introduced in the ISP methodology called the actionable window.
The actionable window allows projects like HumeLink to move forward even if the cost-benefit analysis suggests a much later optimal delivery year. Essentially, it gives AEMO the flexibility to argue that rushing HumeLink is justified, even if it means sticking consumers with higher power bills for something that won't deliver benefits for years.
While several stakeholders opposed introducing the actionable window concept, AEMO sided with the two stakeholders who supported this generous concession for transmission project approvals, TransGrid and a lobby group funded by TransGrid. But there's one more hurdle: approval for TransGrid's final application by the regulator. The regulator asked a consultancy to have a look at TransGrid's application before approving it, and their report was scathing. They found TransGrid's application to be incomplete and in places contradictory, disingenuous, and misleading. Why misleading? Because TransGrid's application asked for several $100 million extra to cover the risk of missing a 2026 deadline. Transgrid said the deadline was AEMO's, but the independent engineers found that actually 2026 was a date Transgrid set for themselves. The regulator, to their credit, knocked these risk overrun costs off the request and told Transgrid to handle most of the risk themselves. Oh, and there was even an admission that Transgrid made a couple of flat-out mistakes in their calculations, like accidentally asking for an extra $100 million. Whoops.
What the hell?
So do AEMO and the regulator protect the public interests of consumers or the private interests of Transgrid? To answer that question, we need to look at who knew what and when throughout this approval process. When approving the very first request for funding, the regulator already knew the costs would increase, and they knew that Transgrid had no plans to consider pausing after stage 1, despite this being the whole point of breaking HumeLink into stages. And before the very last application for funding, Transgrid seemed to already know that AEMO's next draft ISP would have enough benefits to cover the latest cost blowout, and that they'd get the feedback loop approval immediately despite that requiring a rule breach to skip consultation. Not every investment is good value for consumers, and right now is not always the best time to deliver projects. That's why we need to be able to trust regulators and market operators to do their job and stop unnecessary projects being approved. If they don't do their job, not only do consumers end up paying more, but crucial capital, skills, and resources are diverted from better projects that could more effectively decarbonise the grid, increase housing supply, or expand transport infrastructure. That's why it's essential that these energy market bodies are held accountable for their decisions. A Senate inquiry into energy regulation was recently announced. If you want to read our submission on HumeLink or make your voice heard on this issue, head to the link in the description.